Korea's not interested in diplomacy until it tests a nuclear bomb above ground and has a ballistic missile capable of reaching the east coast of the U.S. A capability the Kim regime has been working furiously to perfect, including a recent test firing.
It is a high-risk option for North Korea to pursue. We don't know yet what the dynamic will unveil, but this pressure could tip toward diplomacy and a diplomatic opening, or it could tip toward some escalatory action-reaction cycle.
Neither North Korean officials nor U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson are ruling diplomacy out. But in an interview with CNN's Jake Tapper, Tillerson also seemed to warn those efforts might fail.
Those diplomatic efforts will continue until the first bomb drops.
Military tensions on the Korean peninsula are once again ramping up tonight. An American aircraft carrier strike group, along with a nuclear-powered submarine, have launched joint naval exercises with South Korea near the maritime border with North Korea. American families in the region also dealing with the stress.
Again, this will protect your child from chemical and biological agent to up to 12 hours.
In the coming days, families of American servicemen will be taking part in drills like these on how to evacuate the region if war breaks out.
There is a significant number of military personnel that have their families that are there. They would have to be evacuated. Embassy personnel would have to be evacuated. This would be a significant mess, and there would be sacrifices that would be made on both sides.
Meantime, America's war plans for North Korea are drawing anger from one of Kim Jong-un's top diplomats. His deputy ambassador to the UN calling dangerous a plan by the U.S. and South Korea to decapitate the leadership of North Korea if there's a conflict. A South Korean official says those war plans were stolen by North Korean hackers, who experts say keep getting better at security thefts, along with cyber heists from banks and other entities worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
The Korean state, its intelligence agencies, are leading cyber criminals going after banks. They've put a lot of money into hacking. They have strong teams. And if you compare where they were, say, 5 years ago.
Defend our people, our nations, and our civilization from all who dare to threaten our way of life. This includes the regime of North Korea, which has once again shown its utter contempt for its neighbors and for the entire world community. After seeing your capabilities and commitment here today, I am more confident than ever that our options in addressing this threat are both effective and overwhelming.
President Trump declaring that our military is more than capable of using military options against North Korea if they need to. Now, his comments coming just before tonight's declaration from North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, who's now vowing that he'll complete the nuclear weapons program despite these sanctions, and this on the heels of North Korea's most recent missile test, which, by the way, flew almost 2,300 miles last night over Japan. Here to discuss, Rebecca Grant, president of IRIS Independent Research and a former Secretary of the Air Force, and Fred Fleitz, senior vice president at the Center for Security Policy. Rebecca, let me start with you. Just moments ago, Kim Jong-un putting out a communique, or at least something coming out of North Korea, saying that their goal is, quote, equilibrium with the U.S. What exactly does that mean to you?
Equilibrium. Well, it's new that we're hearing he has a goal. He's always said he wants a nuclear weapon. He wants to be part of that club. And now he's saying, maybe my missile program is almost finished and ready. But the other thing he said, he doesn't want to hear any more about the threats from a U.S. military option. This is good. This means we're really getting to him. Theresa May has not ruled.
You think this is a form of blinking, then? You think he's actually beginning to blink?
I think he might be starting to blink. So we need to keep that military pressure on and let the UN keep working those sanctions.
Right, and I gave you a promotion in your intro. You weren't. You were in the office of the Secretary of the Air Force, right?
Got it right.
All right. Fred Fleitz is with us again. Fred, I want to ask you the same question because obviously North Korea has seemed their belligerence knows no bounds. They meet sanctions and UN action and even tough talk from our own president with more action on their part. Do you think maybe we're seeing them blink just a little bit here?
You know, it could be. I still think the North Koreans have seen years of U.S. administrations passing UN Security Council resolutions and patting themselves on the back and then not enforcing them. But we have a national security advisor today who said there are military options for North Korea. I think that was extraordinary. That comment is going to reverberate throughout the Asia Pacific, and I hope it really makes a difference with China. We really need China's help.
You know, here's the thing, though. The last couple of weeks, we've read a lot of news out of the military of accidents involving training missions and things like that, and it reminds us of just how dilapidated this military is that President Trump inherited, Fred. Are we even capable of carrying out any sort of real military action against North Korea with the potential 5 million man army?
I think we're capable of carrying it out, but we have larger threats we're facing from Russia and China. There are readiness issues in every branch of the services. There has not been sufficient spending on aircraft, or on ships. We know that our missile defense system is in trouble, and our nuclear deterrent. Did you know the average nuclear weapon in our deterrent is 27 years old, and we actually cannibalize old weapons to find parts for some of these weapons?
Yeah.
There's a lot we have to do to bring our military back up to speed.
Rebecca, play it out for us. President Trump will be at the United Nations on next week. He is going to call on other nations, and I think including South Korea, to also step up the pressure here. How do you see this ending?
And I'm impressed with South Korea. They have said, put it on, do the diplomatic options, do the military pressure. I see this ending at the negotiating table. It may take us another couple months. There is, I think, a chance of some limited military
Will we write
action.
a big check to North Korea directly or indirectly?
Well, you've got the point. We're doing sticks now. We haven't even started on the carrots. So I think we'll need some carrots as well in the end.
The former U.S. chief negotiator has a slightly different take on how the issues surrounding the rising tensions should be approached. The diplomat who helped resolve the first North Korean nuclear crisis was in Seoul this week to meet with President Moon Jae-in. Before he left, our Kim Hye-sung got to sit down with Robert Gallucci for his take on the matter.
Thank you for speaking with us today, Ambassador Gallucci.
It's been my pleasure.
Let me jump straight into some questions. So you met with President Moon this Monday. Can you share with us what you've discussed with him?
I told President Moon that I appreciated his opening and openness to negotiations with the North. I thought it was the right thing to do. There are things that the Republic of Korea can address that others can't, including the United States, that when we talk about next steps to integrating North Korea into the international economy, economic development.
You helped resolve the first North Korean crisis through dialogue during the Clinton administration. Like you said, President Moon wants to solve this crisis through dialogue too. Well, critics say it's pointless to pursue negotiation at this point. What do you think?
I frankly don't understand an argument that it's pointless to pursue negotiations. And what's at stake here is actually South Korean security, life and death for lots of people on both sides of the DMZ. And I would want there to be absolutely no choice at the end of the day other than to use the military force if we had to.
But right now, with the U.S. and North Korea locked in a tug of war, how do you suggest we go about starting negotiations?
Stop with the preconditions. Meet and then indicate what would disrupt future discussions. Tell the other side that, and if they wish to continue, then they'll avoid the behavior that would be disruptive.
We're getting mixed messages from Washington. President Trump is maintaining his hardline stance, while his aides are hinting at a possible dialogue. Where do you think Washington really stands right now?
I would discourage you from thinking that this is an orchestrated policy, as it is sometimes known as good cop, bad cop. I don't think that's what's going on. I think that the president is being Donald Trump, and I think the people who elected him, and they are the American people, like that about him. It makes it particularly challenging for the people around him when he says what he thinks about what they are doing. But it is the way the U.S. government now works.
President Trump will visit South Korea next month and sit down with President Moon. What kind of message do you think the two leaders should send to North Korea?
From my perspective, it is most important that the two presidents send a very clear message to the DPRK that the alliance between Seoul and Washington is solid. They are joined, combined, agreed that a peaceful resolution of the current situation would be the best way to go. But at the end of the day, both countries, both the Republic of Korea and the United States, will honor their alliance commitment to the other if their security is threatened.
He knew what he was getting into by joining that 1%. He knew what the possibilities were because we're at war. And when he died, in the 4 cases we're talking about in Niger, my son's case in Afghanistan, when he died, he was surrounded by the best men on this earth, his friends. That's what the president tried to say to 4 families the other day. I was stunned when I came to work yesterday morning and brokenhearted at what I saw a member of Congress doing. A member of Congress who listened in on a phone call from the President of the United States to a young wife, and in his way tried to express that opinion. He's a brave man, a fallen hero. He knew what he was getting himself into because he enlisted. There's no reason to enlist. He enlisted. And he was where he wanted to be, exactly where he wanted to be, with exactly the people he wanted to be with when his life was taken. That was the message. That was the message that was transmitted. It stuns me that a member of Congress would have listened in on that conversation. Absolutely stuns me.
Let's get some more with our correspondents and analysts right now, and John Kirby. You know General Kelly. You worked with General Kelly at the Pentagon. What do you make of his appearance today?
I can tell you it's not something that he would have wanted to do, and it was gut-wrenching to watch, crushing really, to listen to him have to go through that. I can just imagine how painful that was for him to have to talk about his son and his own loss in that very personal way. And there's nobody I know more credible on the pain and suffering that Gold Star families go through like John Kelly, and that certainly came across there. I was, though, sorry to see that the press conference and his comments got as political as they did, especially towards the end, and his takedown of Representative Wilson. I think we need to remember she knows this family. She was in that car. The phone was on speaker. It's not like she wiretapped this call. They wanted her there. They wanted her to listen to it. And I think we need to keep that in mind. I also think it's really important. He talked about the message that was transmitted to those families. And I get it. And I've heard those words before inside the military. But transmission of a message isn't receipt, and we need to at least allow for the possibility that a young 24-year-old woman with 2 kids and 1 on the way just became a widow, her whole life is devastated, is going to hear those words a little differently than he did when he was an active duty 3-star general, hearing it from another general friend. I think we just need to allow for that.
And he also kept saying this is what the president tried to say. He said it in his own way. Yeah. And we don't know exactly how the president said it or what exactly he said, and clearly wasn't interpreted that way. Right. It clearly wasn't.
You know, Caitlin, you cover the White House on a day-to-day basis. Do we know why General Kelly decided to come out and deliver that powerful statement today?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the only person in that White House who was qualified to come out and answer these kinds of questions was John Kelly, because not only does he have the credibility of being a 4-star Marine general, but he has the experience of someone who has gone through something so devastating like this. And also, he was brought into this situation by the president when he invoked his son. It's implied that Barack Obama had not called the Kelly family when his son, Robert Kelly, died, which John Kelly confirmed today. He said he didn't mean that as a criticism when he said that he hadn't called. He just stated that he hadn't called. But I think both things can be true here. I think the president could have called Sergeant LaDavid Johnson's wife and tried to convey this sense of grief and empathy to her. And I think it can also be true, which is what John Kelly just defended right there by saying he was trying to say what Joseph Dunford had said to him. But I think it can also be true that the wife received it in a much different manner. I mean, she was at the airport about when her husband's remains were being brought in. So I think both of those things can be true, and it could have been a mixed message.
Well, you know, Jeffrey, I just want to know, I just want you to weigh in. How did you see it?
Well, I think it's also worth remembering what started this whole controversy. Right. And as you were doing the introduction, I was thinking, like, what planet are we on? You said the controversy over the president's condolence calls. Like what country has controversy over condolence calls? I mean, it's an example of what a surreal moment we're in. But remember, what started this was when President Trump made false statements about President Obama's practices with regard to Gold Star families. I mean, it was like no one told Donald Trump to make these false statements. No, and you know, you saw how Obama's staff was enraged by this, because this is something, you know, he took seriously, as virtually all presidents take seriously. So, you know, yes, maybe there was some misinterpretation of what went on in this particular phone call, but there's no misinterpretation that Donald Trump made false statements about Barack Obama's practices.
And what General Kelly did not do today is talk about how he felt when the president injected his son into this entire conversation. When he said to, I believe it was on talk radio, ask General Kelly, because he didn't get the phone call. I doubt that General Kelly was pleased that his private conversation with the president about what happened during his own grief was made public, and now he had to go out there and do a little bit of cleanup for the president, which is what he was doing.
A very significant day, and Jeffrey, let me come back to you, because we also heard from two former presidents today. I want to play for you a clip. This is President Obama today. He's out on the campaign trail in New Jersey, trying to help the Democratic candidate there for governor, and he took a swipe at President Trump without mentioning, of course, his name. Listen to this.
But what we can't have is the same old politics of division that we have seen so many times before, that dates back centuries. Some of the politics we see now, we thought we put that to bed. I mean, that's folks looking 50 years back. It's the 21st century. Not the 19th century.
Yeah, Jeffrey, I want your reaction.
I remember him. I thought he was in the witness protection program. I mean, it's just so startling. You know, he has really disappeared as a public figure. And, you know, I think Democrats are going to be very glad to see him again, because it is a party without a clear leader. And he remains certainly very popular among Democrats, and probably, you know, certainly compared to the incumbent president, is very popular. And, you know, in his indirect way, I don't think anyone can mistake who he's talking about.
Let me play a clip from another former president, George W. Bush, also criticizing Trumpism. Caitlin, listen to this without mentioning the president's name.
We've seen our discourse degraded by casual cruelty. At times, it can seem like the forces pulling us apart are stronger than the forces binding us together. Argument turns too easily into animosity. Disagreement escalates into dehumanization. Too often, we judge other groups by their worst examples, while judging ourselves by our best intentions, forgetting the image of God we should see in each other. We've seen nationalism distorted into nativism.
Pretty strong words from him as well.
That was a remarkable speech that we listened to earlier from that former president, because though he did not mention the current president's name, it was very thinly veiled that a lot of those remarks were directed to him as he spoke about bullying and instilling these civic values. And how can you instill those in children if you don't live up to them yourselves? And also about rejecting white supremacy and bigotry. And it reminded me of a statement that George Bush and his father both put out after those deadly clashes in Charlottesville, after President Trump had said there was violence on both sides. Now, they didn't name Trump in that statement either, but they clearly were talking to him, saying that you must reject this, you must reject anti-Semitism and all of those things. But that was a really stunning speech from him, those thinly veiled remarks at Trump, because we rarely saw him say anything, if ever, when President Obama was out.
Out front now, former Clinton White House aide Keith Boykin and former communications director for President Trump's transition team, Brian Lanza, who also was the former deputy communications director for the Trump campaign. Brian, let me start with you. You heard the president. He said he never said what the Congresswoman said. He even said in a tweet it was fabricated. But of course, when you listen to General Kelly, he says the exact same words that the Congresswoman said. Was the president not telling the truth?
Yeah, I just hear it differently than you, Aaron. I hear context, and context matters. What she was trying to portray, what the Congresswoman was trying to portray, was sort of this harsh context where he said these things. But when you hear what General Kelly said in the context where he explains it all, there is a huge distinction. And so when I think the president was saying that's not what he said, it's not in the context that he said these things, and I think that's what the criticism is unfair, but this is where we are today.
Keith.
In other words, what I think Brian is saying is that the President of the United States lied to the American public, but,
no, that's not what I'm saying.
That's exactly what you just said. In other words, he lied to the American public when he denied it. He said the Congresswoman completely fabricated the words. They were the exact same words, and General Kelly confirmed the words. The only thing that Brian is pointing out is that the context might have been different. And I knew this from the very beginning. When I first heard the story, I thought, well, maybe he said it, but he said in a way
he meant something different. He wanted her to hear it a different way than it was
exactly. But what he did is he came right out and he flatly denied it. He went into his normal mode, which is to attack, to make the story about him, and he became this sort of narcissist personality again. He has to learn, if he's going to be the commander-in-chief, he has to learn to be bigger than that.
Brian, because, you know, two members of the family confirmed to us that the president said what the Congresswoman said he said. So when you get at it's the tone of the words that matter, context, let's completely give you that. But if that's what they heard, isn't it incumbent on him to say, gosh, that's not what I meant? To be the kind and empathetic one.
And we don't know what follow-up conversations they're going to have through the course of, you know, the president being president of the United States. We don't know how long he's going to be engaged with this. And I think we should allow this private moment between a president, commander-in-chief, with the families of soldiers who have fallen. And I think what you have now is the media is looking to dissect everything. What I saw earlier in General Kelly's, press conference earlier, it was a complete rebuke of the coverage of the last 72 hours on this specific phone call. This is the problem that's occurring. We're not giving the president the benefit of the doubt. We're jumping to the most negative conclusion, sort of like a political hit piece, and we get lost in these things. And I think that's the problem here.
I of course feel it then incumbent upon me to say if he's frustrated with the past 72 hours, there's one person he should be frustrated at, and that's the person who started the entire thing by politicizing it, which is President Trump. So he can be frustrated at everybody else, but nobody was talking about it until the president said what he said.
Donald Trump.
Hold on a second. Hold on. The media is the one who politicized this by saying, "Hey, when did you actually call him? You've been tweeting on these things, but you haven't called the family." That's actually what took place. Let's follow the sequence of events.
First of all,
so the media is the one who sort of started this sort of storyline.
Brian, the media has its job. Let's not make this a media bashing session.
For them to be accurate.
Let me speak for a chance, okay? Brian, what's going on here is that 4 American soldiers were killed in Niger 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks and 1 day ago now, and the President of the United States took 12 days to even acknowledge it. The Defense Department, the National Security Staff rather, drafted a statement for the President to issue. He did not issue that statement. He never talked about it. He didn't tweet about it. He was busy attacking Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and the NFL during that time. He only talked about it on Monday because a reporter asked him a question about it, because he had been not saying anything about it. And this young man, LaDavid Johnson, his body was lying out there in the desert in Niger for 2 whole days practically, and the United States government had done nothing to rescue him. Yes, the American people want to know what happened. We want answers. His family deserves answers.
Absolutely.
And that's the reason why the widow and the mother confirmed what Congressman Federico Wilson said.
All right, so let me just hear, John Kelly said that there were many things that were sacred in this country, Gold Star families included. But he said it's no longer the case, Brian. And he said the last thing that may be sacred in this country is the men and women who give their life fighting for the United States. He pleaded for that to remain true. Here he is.
I still hope, as you write your stories, and I appeal to America, that let's not let this maybe last thing that's held sacred in our society. A young man, young woman going out and giving his or her life for our country. Let's try to somehow keep that sacred. But it eroded a great deal yesterday by the selfish behavior of a member of Congress.
Brian, are you all right with that, bringing in the member of Congress into this?
I mean, I would say this. She shouldn't have spoke out without the complete context of her statement. I think this should be a very personal phone call between the family and the president. Some presidents make these calls, some presidents don't. It really doesn't matter what each individual president has to process. But this should be a private moment. And for her to politicize it the way she did, she brought in a political twist to something that should have been a very personal moment between the president and this family. And I find that to be repulsive. We need to let these families mourn. We need to support them. We need to prop them up. We need to love them. We need to encourage them. We need to do all these things. But the last thing we need to do is politicize them. And what you saw that out of the Congresswoman.
I agree. We should not politicize this. But if this was such a sacred call, why was the chief of staff on the call? Why were other people in the White House staff on the call? It's not just a communication between one person and another. Frederica Wilson was a family friend of LaDavid Johnson. Yes. She knew this young man from the time he was growing up. She had a right to be there. She was in the car with the widow at the time this happened. And the idea that Donald Trump and the White House is trying to make this an attack on Frederica Wilson instead of taking responsibility for what they did not do, how they failed in Niger, is an abdication of their responsibility.
All right, thank you both. And next, what happened in Niger? John McCain is threatening subpoenas on the Niger ambush. Why are
later French jets flew over the battlefield trying to scare off the ISIS fighters? They had no authority to fire on them. It was close to an hour before French military helicopters and a U.S. contractor aircraft came in to evacuate the dead and wounded, U.S. officials say.
Did they know what was going on in the area? Were they sharing it with the right people? Did the African countries know something that the U.S. advisors did not know and they didn't share? That's another area. Third area might be, how do you evacuate if you have potential casualties?
Tough questions now face the Pentagon and the president. What happened during the firefight? How did Sergeant LaDavid Johnson get left behind? Was he killed instantly? What does the White House know? All important questions to understand what went wrong. Especially, how did Sergeant Johnson get separated from his fellow soldiers? When the evacuation aircraft took off, they were one man short. No one can yet say why Johnson wasn't picked up.
The U.S. military does not leave its troops behind, and I would just ask that you not question the actions of the troops who were caught in the firefight and question whether or not they did everything they could in order to bring everyone out at once.
Because nobody knew if he might be alive still, plans for a secret Navy SEAL rescue mission were made. Sergeant Johnson's body was found nearly 48 hours later. Nobody can say why and how he was left behind.
The Pentagon is very much making the case that the troops on the ground did everything they could to find Sergeant Johnson, but we have not been given the full narrative yet. That said, today we saw the Chief of Staff of the White House, John Kelly, Secretary Mattis, out for the first time in public discussing all of this in detail. We're told very much part of the administration effort, Aaron, to recapture the narrative on this story.
All right, Barbara, thank you very much. And out front now, the former Director of Communications for U.S. National Intelligence, Sean Turner. He served 21 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, including tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Former CIA operative and CNN intelligence and security analyst Bob Baer joins us, along with former member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and former Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. You all know a whole lot about what we need to know about what happened here. Colonel Leighton, let me start with you. You just heard Barbara's report. So many questions we don't know the answers to. John McCain saying he's considering subpoenas because he is not getting any answers at all right now. What is the issue here? Why are there no answers going to the Senate Armed Services Committee or information going to them at all?
Well, Aaron, right now I think there is probably very little information going to the Armed Service Committees, both in the House and in the Senate. And part of it may be because the Pentagon is actually looking at what exactly happened. So they believe they have to first make sure that everything is set up exactly correctly so that they can then present it to Congress. Of course, Congress is going to look at this and they're going to say, we need to know now what happened. Right. Part of it is a resourcing question, and of course, Congress holds the purse strings.
Right, and of course, as John McCain said, that's not how it works. They get all the information right away as co-equal branches of government. Bob, last night you said this is worse than Benghazi because Benghazi was the ambassador's decision, right? So that was on, he's the one who made that decision. But in this case, it was the Pentagon's decision, ultimately the commander-in-chief's responsibility. Do you think they know any more than they are telling us, the sort of John McCain feeling when he said they are not being upfront?
Well, Aaron, I think a mistake was made. Those guys clearly were surprised in an ambush. The intelligence was bad. They shouldn't have been up there. There was no backup. The fact that contractors had to rescue them, the fact that the French flew over the site but couldn't fire, it was a fiasco. They were set up, and I think through the command, through the Pentagon, people understand this. A huge mistake was made, and I don't, whose fault was it? The fact that these guys fought heroically and got out of there, the fact that somebody was left behind, that happens in the confusion of combat. But the question is, who sent them up there? And, the president is saying, look, we've defeated ISIS in Raqqa. I've done it finally. The past administration failed. But in fact, ISIS is very much active, and this is something that people aren't prepared to admit in the administration.
And I want to do more, talk more about that in just a moment, because it's a crucial point. But Sean, what about the point Bob raises, right? They go into this village, and they obviously don't have the intelligence, right, that there's 50 ISIS-linked militants who are there. A lot of people there would have known that. This is a village they've been to a lot of times before. It would seem it was intelligence that someone should have had. And yet they get in there. 30 minutes later, the French fly over, and they're not even allowed to drop any ordnance if they had any. They're not even allowed to do that. Contractors have to get these guys out. Does all of this trouble you?
It does, Aaron, and I think the intelligence is the most important point here. The military investigators are going to be looking at this intelligence from a bunch of different perspectives. They're going to look at the source of the intelligence. They're going to look at the age of the intelligence. Was this recent intelligence, or were they operating based on old intelligence? And I think one of the other really important questions is they're going to look at how this intelligence that they were operating under when they decided to take this particular action, how that intelligence compared to intelligence that they had previously in the area. If you've had intelligence that indicates that the area is fairly permissive for quite some time, and as a result you begin to get into a rhythm and operate a certain way in a hostile area, and then that environment changes, oftentimes that's what you see when events like this happen.
Yeah, and Sean, it also seems though somebody, if that's the case, there was a huge misjudgment or miscalculation that was made, because there was an expectation that people in that local environment were going to be upfront about this kind of information. And obviously they weren't. You don't have 50 ISIS-linked fighters in a village like this with a lot of people around there not knowing about it.
No, but it's absolutely right. But it's also the case that if this was good intelligence, and understand that this is an environment where we tend to have fairly good intelligence, I think that one of two things will happen here. Either we're going to discover that there was something about the intelligence that changed fairly rapidly, and so that we no longer had good visibility of what was happening on the ground, or those attackers, those fighters had some information that we were not able to glean in intelligence because they got it fairly recently. So there are a lot of questions to be answered here. But the one thing I will say, Aaron, is that no matter what this investigation finds, absolutely nothing should take away from the sacrifice that these brave men made. And I think that from the top down, we need to make sure that we honor their service and wrap our arms around these families, because they're really going to need our support.
And quickly before we go, Bob, I just want to play to your point, the president just in the past few weeks talking about how well his administration is doing against ISIS. Here he is.
We have done better in 8 months of my presidency than the previous 8 years against ISIS.
We have made great strides against ISIS.
ISIS is now giving up. They're giving up.
And yet here they are, active in a country most Americans don't often hear of. 50 of them in one village, Bob.
Aaron, yeah, it's a mistake. I mean, losing Raqqa is important to them, but not crucial. ISIS is coming back, and it will strike back, whether it's in Chad or Mali or Niger. They will come back, or the Middle East. And we're not done with this war, and to claim victory is a big mistake on the administration's part. I guarantee you that.
All right, thank you all.